I used to arrive in the beating heart of Manhattan before the sun rose. The cold lights of the skyscrapers still shone like stakes driven into the city's chest. As I walked down the sidewalk in my impeccable suit, steaming coffee in hand, and my cell phone already pressed to my ear, absorbing orders like a well-trained machine. For almost 5 years, my life was a blur of blue screens with hysterical charts, screams muffled by glass rooms, and an emotional roller coaster that made my stomach turn with every swing in the market. Working 80 hours a week on Wall Street wasn't just an exaggeration to make those outside that world envious. It was a sentence I had signed myself, seduced by fat bonuses and the promise of power. But what no one told me was how those polished marble walls hid a psychological slaughterhouse, where older executives drank their blood without even staining their silk ties. I put up with everything in silence, even when I felt strange pains in my chest, or when I woke up in the middle of the night with my heart racing, certain that I was having a heart attack at the age of 29. After all, who could complain in an environment where the culture was, "If you don't die for the company, you don't deserve to be here"? What I didn't expect was that, at the height of my devotion, after sacrificing my birthdays, my friends, and even my father's funeral, I would be kicked out like a mangy dog without any ceremony. It was a rainy Friday. The heavy clouds seemed to foretell my fate. My boss, the same one who praised my superhuman disposition in meetings, called me into a room too small to contain my panic. Without even looking up from the iPad, he blurted out, "Unfortunately, we need to cut costs. Your position has been terminated." And that was it. There was no handshake, not even a thank you for everything. They handed me a cardboard box, a severance check that looked like a dirty consolation trophy, and escorted me to the elevator as if I were a thief. There, with my forehead pressed against the mirrored wall, I swore that it wouldn't end like this. I would make that same market that had chewed me up and spat me out without mercy swallow my name again, but this time as the owner of the game. What I didn't imagine was that my path to revenge would also transform the concept of empire in the heart of Wall Street. I left the building that Friday with the feeling that the ground in Manhattan was a tilted platform, ready to push me towards an invisible abyss. The noise of the taxis, the annoying buzz of the sirens, the acrid smell of smoke mixed with the burnt pretzels in the street carts. Everything seemed to mock me, reminding me that the game kept on turning, indifferent to my fall. I spent days locked in my tiny apartment on the Upper East Side, staring at the peeling ceiling as if it were a whiteboard where I mentally scribbled 1,000 plans for retaliation. I slept badly, woke up sweaty, my face marked by the crumpled sheets and the anxiety that squeezed my chest with sharp claws. In the first week, I almost tore up my severance check, overcome by stupid pride. But something inside me whispered that it was just the initial fuel for what I planned. I began to study the market with the fanaticism of a cloistered monk, spending hours and hours poring over reports, reading tiny lines of financial statements that no one noticed, listening to conference calls from rival companies where the CEO's voices sometimes wavered at critical points. It was one morning, while I was holding a glass of cheap whiskey, and my eyes were burning from staring at the laptop screen, that I noticed a grotesque flaw in the strategy of 2 direct competitors of the bank that had kicked me out. It was almost like finding a trail of blood in a dark hallway. There was the loophole. I took my severance check, some spare change saved from previous bonuses, and aggressively entered short positions that bet against these rivals. I used my inside knowledge, not for insider trading, but to anticipate every move, every reaction of the market, understanding the behavior of those sharks better than they did. In the first few days, I almost collapsed. I saw my capital swing dangerously, threatening to disappear. But then panic began to spread across the financial news. Small headlines about cash flow problems popped up. Then came the bigger stories, with tense-faced analysts trying to calm investors on TV channels, while I sat alone in my dark apartment, smiling with the corners of my mouth, savoring the impending doom of those who had once treated me as disposable. In less than 6 months, my bets had paid off enough for me to buy significant stakes in funds that were directly exposed to those banks. And so, for the first time, I was no longer a pawn breaking my back to make profits for invisible masters. I was starting to shape the board, and each future move would only increase my hunger. Over time, the solitude of my small apartment gave way to a financial bunker, filled with stacked screens, thick wires running across the floor like hungry snakes, processors humming day and night to provide me with real-time data. I woke up to alerts going off on my cell phone and fell asleep to the constant sound of charts flashing red or green, depending on the mood of the market. Little by little, that sound became my personal, almost soothing chant. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, former colleagues who had once treated me like a luxury slave were beginning to feel the impact of my silent advances. I could tell by the evasive interviews they gave, by the dry notes sent to the press trying to stifle rumors of compromised liquidity. At shareholder meetings, videos circulated showing pale faces, averted eyes, sweat breaking out on once confident foreheads. And that was just the beginning. I used every dollar I earned to reinvest in ever bolder positions, buying bad debts they would need to roll over, controlling tiny levers that would one day become chains around their necks. Meanwhile, I made a point of keeping a low profile. I didn't give interviews. I didn't go to elite parties. I didn't flaunt my success with ridiculous cars or studded watches. I'd learned that discretion is the sharpest blade when seeking revenge in markets thirsty for new blood. One day, I sat in a discreet cafe across from the building where I had been summarily fired. I watched the employees hurrying in and out, some laughing on their cell phones, others frowning, all so sure that they belonged in this unshakable world. If only they had known that the foundation that supported their bonuses, their astronomical rents, their lobster dinners, was about to crack from within. I found myself smiling as I remembered the director who had signed my resignation. He appeared on a business program defending the structural solidity of the firm in times of volatility, while I already held crucial credits that, in practice, gave me the power to dictate the next step of its destiny. Every word he said to reassure shareholders was, for me, music. My revenge would not be just to see them lose money. I wanted to watch the slow decomposition of their pride, the terror blossoming in their eyes as they realized that they were in the hands of someone they had once stepped on without remorse. Because in this game, public humiliation is the only currency that really counts. Months later, the situation began to deteriorate so perfectly that it almost seemed scripted by invisible hands. The bank that had fired me was caught in a liquidity trap carefully set by me and other predators who smelled the same blood. Its credit lines evaporated. Partner funds withdrew investments in a domino effect, and analysts began downgrading its ratings with a speed that reminded me of vultures swooping down on a still warm corpse. Meanwhile, I met discreetly with groups of institutional investors, sovereign wealth funds, and foreign managers who would never have guessed that this thin man in the sober suit and controlled speech was once a weary analyst running between crowded desks and blaring phones. During these meetings, I said little and let detailed reports do the dirty work, charts and projections that showed the bank's inevitable fate if they didn't accept my terms for the purchase of certain crucial assets. Deep down, I wanted something more than profit. I wanted their operations torn apart, their directors publicly fired, their luxurious offices empty, their furniture auctioned off for fractions of its value, like forgotten carcasses. And little by little, I achieved this. One grey afternoon, I was notified by email that my consortium had assumed majority control over a strategic portfolio that supported part of the bank's most profitable derivatives. Without it, its revenues would wither like grapes in the sun. There was no party, no champagne popping. My victory was silent, savored alone in the silence of my office. I spent hours staring at the New York skyline, feeling an almost physical pleasure in imagining the conference rooms where I had once sat with the hunched posture of someone begging for recognition, now transformed into empty vaults of unfulfilled promises. Soon news of massive cuts emerged. Photos of analysts and associates leaving with cardboard boxes flooded the internet. It was the same image I had once represented, but now replicated in dozens of featureless faces. Some of them recognized me later, years later, at smaller financial events. They tried to hide their embarrassment, their voices trembling as they greeted the man who had silently delivered the death blow to the entire culture of arrogance they themselves had helped to create. For me, there was no need for irony or direct provocation. The mere fact of existing, of standing there with my head held high, was more humiliating to them than any cutting remark I could have said. The months that followed were like watching a controlled implosion in slow motion. While the media focused on CEOs spouting hollow promises to calm investors, I watched the internal spreadsheets, the cash flows draining, the projections growing redder. The collapse didn't come like an earthquake out of nowhere, but like a silent cancer that spread, eating away at entire departments until nothing was left but empty shells. In the process, I became a near mythological figure behind the scenes on Wall Street. No one spoke my name openly in the plush offices where I'd once been sent to fetch coffee or review spreadsheets at 3 a.m. But everyone knew the stories, the analyst who'd been fired without warning, who'd re-emerged in the market not as a competitor, but as a silent predator, moving billions through anonymous trusts, family funds, and structures so labyrinthine they were impossible to trace. Even those who suspected it never had proof. Everything was done within the rules of the game, exploiting loopholes, showing off clean contracts, reports audited by reputable firms. I watched the indignant protests of small investors who had lost their savings when stocks plummeted, shouting against hedge funds, without imagining that at the epicenter of all that chaos was someone who knew every corridor of that bank, every cultural flaw, every leadership weakness intimately. That was what gave me the advantage. Not just the capital, but the visceral understanding of the inflated pride that blinded them to obvious signs. Meanwhile, their personal lives were also beginning to fall apart. I saw families falling apart, divorce cases piling up, mansions for sale at embarrassing prices. Once I ran into a former director of mine by chance in a modest restaurant, far from the expensive avenues. He was thinner, his eyes sunken. He noticed my presence, pretended not to see, but the subtle tremor in his hands betrayed his panic at sharing the same room with me. That I was certain that my revenge had gone beyond the balance sheet, had infiltrated their psychology, eroding their self-esteem to the bone. In parallel, I was consolidating other assets, buying discrete stakes in financial startups and predictive analytics technology companies, building an ecosystem designed to one day replace the old banks entirely, with lower fees, automated processes, and eliminating the very toxic culture that had once nearly destroyed my sanity. There was no altruism in this. It was pure power instinct, to shape the market in my image, but with the delightful advantage of knowing that every step I took was erasing their legacy. And when the bank that had kicked me out was finally forced to announce technical bankruptcy, I was in a discreet hotel in Zurich, sitting on a cold stone balcony, reading the news on my tablet with the same impassive expression I had developed after years of humiliation. There was no toast, not even a sigh of relief, just the solid, almost brutal certainty that this circle had closed the way I had always dreamed, not with a loud bang, but with the muffled sound of doors closing and never opening again. My accounts continued to grow. My influence in the industry solidified to the point where analysts who would never shake my hand found themselves studying my moves as if they were prophecies. And deep down, where my original anger had burned, there was only an empty space, cold but strangely satisfying. I had become the silent storm that destroyed the world that rejected me. After the bank's final collapse, there was no grand jury, no headlines pointing directly at me. And that was exactly how I wanted it. Unlike those vain CEOs who appeared smiling on magazine covers holding leadership awards, I didn't need public glory. For me, the true taste of victory was invisible, almost intimate. It was walking the streets of Manhattan and noticing the subtle changes. For lease signs on once crowded buildings, consultants who once spoke loudly in coffee shops now whispering desperate offers in impromptu meetings, financial reporters circling like vultures after fresh bankruptcies. Meanwhile, I continued to quietly invest in adjacent sectors, buying clearinghouses, automated compliance algorithms, small auditing firms that would one day validate the balance sheets of my future rivals. All pieces on a much larger board, the edges of which I didn't even need to reveal yet. In one of these maneuvers, I ended up taking indirect control of a real estate fund that, by pure coincidence, was a commercial mortgage lender to the same bank that had fired me. This meant that behind the scenes, I was literally collecting interest from my former bosses, pushing for foreclosures that would force them to sell off historic headquarters for pennies. In discreet meetings with legal representatives, I saw tense faces and hands that kept rubbing pens or papers together, fearing that any wrong comma could seal the fate of what was left. It was at this point that I realized how much I had changed. I was no longer just the ambitious young man whose pride had been wounded. I had evolved into something colder, almost surgical. My decisions were no longer based on moral debates about right or wrong. I simply did what the game required to maintain my position, to expand my reach, to ensure that no one would ever have the power to subjugate me again. Sometimes, in sleepless nights, I would find myself mentally revisiting that day I was fired, hearing the phrase, "We need to cut costs," uttered with such disdain, and realizing how much that had shaped every one of my choices. It was a slow poison, but it immunized me against any future weakness. My lawyers learned to speak in encrypted code. My consultants rarely received a complete picture of my movements. I myself spent most of my time disconnected from any genuine human contact, focused only on the next targets, the next numbers to move on the board. Revenge was no longer a one-off event. It had become the continuous engine of my empire, and no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, I knew I was as corrupt as the men I had dethroned. The difference was that I would never need the spotlight or the pat on the back. My recognition came from seeing haggard faces, desperate contracts, tense meetings ruled by fear of what I might do next. This heavy silence, laden with implicit threats, was the perfect symphony to mark my reign. Over time, what began as a personal retaliation against a handful of proud men grew into something I could not even have foreseen. My network of acquisitions and stakes grew so deeply embedded in the financial system that I inevitably began to influence entire markets, affecting thousands of employees who had never crossed my path. There was something almost ironic about this. I had initially dreamed only of taking down those few executives who had humiliated me, that the scope of my moves sent out shockwaves that ended careers, destroyed small offices, and upended families who depended on steady paychecks to pay their mortgages, their tuition, and their health insurance. At times, sitting in the darkness of my midtown penthouse, I could hear in my own mind the voices of these strangers who were now losing jobs, trying to renegotiate debts, struggling to keep local businesses alive in cities that indirectly depended on the health of big banks. Perhaps anyone else in my shoes would have felt remorse, or at least a flicker of compassion. But my soul seemed to have been recalibrated to ignore such pleas. I had not forgotten the bitter taste of being dismissed as an obsolete object. After sacrificing youth, health and family ties for the sake of quarterly reports that only enriched invisible shareholders, that wound had formed a hard shell, impervious to sentimentality. Still, sometimes I would watch, almost clinically, Interviews with former employees of the companies that had fallen because of my indirect blows, simple people who had never set foot in a boardroom, but who paid the price for the erratic decisions and greed of their bosses. I saw men with choked voices trying to explain to local reporters how they would keep their homes, women clasping their young children's hands as they talked about moving to another city in search of a new livelihood. And although I felt no guilt, I recognized the cruel paradox of capitalism. The revenge I had exacted with mathematical precision ended up spreading like a plague, affecting even those who had nothing to do with my downfall. This thought, far from stopping me, only reinforced my conviction that the system was never fair, never designed to protect the weakest link. If I had not been the architect of this ruin, someone else would have been. The only difference is that, in my case, there was a personal, almost poetic purpose, weaving together each step of the destruction. Meanwhile, in the business newspapers, my name was still taboo. It appeared only as rumors, speculative notes in financial columns that discussed a discreet investor moving capital on a large scale. I preferred it that way. The public's eyes focused on the public faces that occupied magazine covers, while I continued to shape the flow of money in silence, establishing rules that were not always visible, but that everyone felt when rates varied, or when unexpected mergers changed the routine of entire sectors. It gave me a sense of almost divine dominion, controlling destinies without ever appearing, pressing invisible buttons that, on the other side of the world, made numbers dance and lives become statistics. The expansion of my empire met no real resistance for a long time. It was as if the market, exhausted by old structures that no longer held up, was ready to be reshaped, even if it meant accepting the yoke of someone as ruthless as the old financial barons. The curious thing is that, as my influence spread, I noticed that other powerful people I had previously seen as unassailable monsters, began to treat me with a cautious, almost superstitious respect. There were no sincere handshakes, no lasting alliances. Everything revolved around cold contracts, shielded by complex clauses that in practice only served to simulate a security that did not exist. I watched veteran investors lose the spark in their eyes during meetings where I politely told them conditions that they knew they had no choice but to accept. It was a veiled power play. No one wanted to challenge the man who had ruined one of the largest banks without blinking. The irony is that, at a certain point, I began to seek out these confrontations. It was no longer enough to simply grow or consolidate capital. I began to cause small market shocks just to watch my competitors' reactions, measuring how much they could take before pulling back. I manipulated announcement dates, spread strategically calculated gossip, and on occasion even simulated massive withdrawals to see the psychological effects on other managers. It was like playing with anthills, poking them with a twig just to watch the chaos boil over. This kind of methodical cruelty drove me further away from any genuine human connection. Old friends who remained disappeared, unable to understand who I had become. Women came and went, drawn by the dark magnetism of power, but they never stayed. Deep down, I made a point of keeping them at arm's length. Any real affection could be exploited as weakness, and I would not give that gift to anyone. On sleepless nights, sitting in my office surrounded by screens pulsing with graphs, I found myself questioning how far I could go. Were there limits? Was it possible by sheer will to trigger crises in entire regions, to collapse pension funds, to watch small countries squirm to protect local currencies? The answer was there, flickering at my fingertips, in the data that flowed every millisecond through my servers. I had enough reach to generate global effects if I wanted to, but there was something even more intoxicating than the act itself. It was the knowledge that I could, and that at any moment I could choose not to do it or decide to do it. This absolute control over the fate of others, so much more than any boss who had ever humiliated me would ever dream of possessing, was the ultimate reward that I would never confess out loud. It was irrefutable proof that my pain had not been in vain, that my brutal downfall had served as the catalyst for a power so vast that no one today would dare repeat to me what they had done in that cramped conference room years ago. All of that had transformed me into a discreet but colossal entity, and somehow I felt comfortably alone on this pedestal erected over collective fear. As the years passed, the sound of market alarms, once a rousing music to my ears, became almost a background noise, so constant that I barely registered their presence. What really kept me awake now was the possibility of testing ever more subtle frontiers of power. I began funding obscure research in predictive modeling, hiring teams of physicists and mathematicians who were used to designing chaotic scenarios that went beyond traditional risk models. They themselves did not fully understand the consequences of what they calculated, but I understood the value of their discoveries. Algorithms that identified patterns imperceptible to any human, capable of anticipating microtrends that, when added together, could dictate global waves of confidence or panic. It was no longer just a matter of buying or selling assets. I was manipulating market sentiment on scales few would dare to imagine. Each time I did this, I felt a chilling thrill, an almost physical rush, not of ordinary pleasure, but of the sense of knowing that behind the numbers and indexes were entire lives adjusting to my invisible touch. Houses sold in a hurry, silent layoffs, marriages crumbling under the weight of financial stress. These were all inevitable byproducts of my mathematical decisions. And yet, as I contemplated these consequences, I felt no remorse, only a curious indifference, like watching a biological experiment continue its course. As I spread my tentacles, so did scattered attempts to contain me. Regulators in smaller countries tried to put up barriers to stop suspicious capital flows. Small coalitions of banks banded together in coordinated strategies, trying to undermine my assets with carefully engineered short squeezes. But each of these moves was foreseen and dismantled before it could even mature. I hired corporate counterintelligence teams to map not only my opponents' financial data, but also their personal weaknesses, hidden vices, hidden debts, extramarital affairs. I didn't need to blackmail them directly. I just had to let them know, discreetly, that I had access to these secrets. Most of them gave in without resistance. For the few who tried to persist, I just had to let out some compromising information through indirect means, and fear did the rest. This subtle method of coercion became my signature. I never had to send explicit threats or hire thugs. My intimidation was sophisticated, almost elegant, based on the certainty that whoever stood up to me would end up destroying themselves out of fear of what might come. Curiously, this colossal power did not bring me the peace I once imagined. On the contrary, it filled my existence with an insidious form of boredom, as if the entire world were now a predictable chessboard, where the pieces followed patterns that I already knew by heart. Nothing surprised me anymore. Neither political scandals, nor sectoral collapses, nor the individual tragedies that unfolded as an indirect consequence of my strategies. I kept playing because there was no alternative. Giving up would be admitting that all the path I had traveled, all the pain swallowed and turned into ice, had served no purpose other than to make me a bored spectator of the very spectacle I had put on. As the cycle progressed, isolation ceased to be a strategic choice and became a permanent condition. The people around me, employees, lawyers, analysts, risk managers, began to treat me as something other than an executive or investor. It was as if they were facing a force of nature that one should respect and fear, but never try to understand or truly get close to. No one dared to strike up casual conversations, ask about my childhood, my family, or whether I had anyone waiting at home. They talked only about indexes, quarterly reports, and discrete mergers that allowed for even more consolidation of what already seemed absolute. I myself made no effort to correct this distance. On the contrary, I maintained additional layers of protocols, fragmented agendas, and meetings divided into deliberate slices of information, so that no one ever had a complete view of what I was commanding. This hermetic environment began to consume even the few human habits that I still preserved. My meals became functional routines, calculated in nutrients and calories, without the slightest culinary pleasure. My clothes were selected by assistants who followed such strict standards of discretion that I sometimes forgot what color I was wearing that day. I slept at irregular hours, sometimes out of sheer need to break an obsessive mental cycle, only to wake up amid fragmented nightmares of dark conference rooms where faceless voices repeated old phrases. "We need to cut costs. You no longer fit the firm's profile." Sometimes I woke up with my heart racing, feeling cold sweat trickle down my temples, before remembering that I was now the cut, the profile, the sharp blade that decided who stayed and who was swept off the board. This brought no solace, only an almost morbid stillness. I became fascinated by reports not only financial but also sociological, which detailed how small economic changes impacted entire neighborhoods, redefined urban migration routes, destroyed local traditions. I would read these long documents in the wee hours of the morning, imagining families packing boxes, retailers closing their doors after decades, students dropping out due to lack of resources. Not because I cared, but because that was the tangible measure of my reach. Each percentage point, each rate change, was like a light touch from me, sending shockwaves on a scale that only I could truly understand. Over time, this almost omnipotent vision completely alienated me from common experience. There were no more films that entertained me, no more books that transported me to other narratives, because they all seemed simplistic compared to the cold complexity of the real data that I processed daily. Fiction was too shallow, while reality offered me a brutal dramaturgy, where I was not just a spectator, but the secret playwright, adjusting invisible strings. I realized then that my journey of revenge had become a much larger project, a self-sufficient mechanism of power that no longer needed to justify its existence with old pains or humiliations. Those early wounds, which had once been pulsing with life, had become scars so rigid that they now supported the entire structure of my personality, like petrified columns. I was no longer the ambitious young man who had been trampled on by vain directors, nor the analyst hungry to prove his worth. I had become something else entirely, an impassive architect of other people's chaos, so far removed from human empathy that even my family memories began to fade silently, reduced to mere data filed away in a remote corner of my mind. The absolute distance I had built up over the years had become so integrated into my routine that I could no longer tell whether it was a conscious choice or simply a reflection of who I had become. Human interaction began to sound like a foreign language to me, whose subtleties, jokes, and concerns seemed ridiculously banal compared to the silent grandeur of what I manipulated on a daily basis. When I had to attend mandatory events, discreet conferences with other global managers, secret meetings in alpine resorts, or fundraising dinners for political campaigns whose backstage I helped to finance, I felt like an intruder among fragile creatures who tried, with rehearsed laughter and clinking glasses, to pretend to master realities they barely understood. I overheard conversations about local mergers, petty disputes over market share that, to me, were nothing more than splashes in an ocean whose tides I commanded almost subconsciously. At times, these encounters amused me. I could subtly observe the tense expressions when executives noticed me, the lowered voices, the indirect glances, fearing that I might detect some vulnerability. There was no need to raise my voice or make any threats. Just being there, silently contemplating, created such palpable discomfort that I could almost feel the atmosphere thickening, as if the air were being sucked out of their lungs. On lonely nights, however, this same absolute power revealed to me the subtle price I was paying. There was no one to genuinely share a triumph or even a moment of failure, should it ever come. There was no family waiting for me with impromptu dinners. No friends to mock my obsessions and restore some of the lightness that had been lost forever. The people around me were paid to obey, to filter problems before they reached me, to ensure that my bubble was as impermeable as my diversified portfolio. Over time, this bubble became more than a protection. It became my own private prison, a gilded jail that I had built myself, brick by brick, contract by contract. Sometimes, sitting in my dark office, staring at the lights of Manhattan pulsing through the enormous windows, I almost expected to see the reflection of who I had been decades ago. The young analyst who arrived too early, left too late, dreaming that all that sacrifice would make him loved, respected, perhaps even envied. Instead, I found only the empty gaze of a lonely emperor, surrounded by pulsating charts that offered him no affection. Yet there was no real regret. Inside me, the conviction was solid as granite. I had done what needed to be done. I had brought down those who needed to fall. I had proven to myself and to the market that no one could dismiss me anymore as a number to be optimized in cruel spreadsheets. What began as revenge evolved into an autonomous system, where my will became entwined with the very forces that governed entire sectors of the economy. It no longer mattered whether my name was plastered across headlines, or whether some future documentary attempted to profile my dark side. I had built something that surpassed narrative, something so intricate that not even its complete destruction would explain the extent of the damage or the control I had established. And even though loneliness was a constant visitor, I realized, with a certain somber lucidity, that this was the inevitable toll taken on those who decide to be the invisible sculptors of other people's destinies. By then, my routine had become an almost ritualistic sequence of detailed reports, silent meetings, and decisions that reverberated thousands of miles away without me having to move an inch. The walls of my office were covered in discrete acoustic panels, the environment designed to be so neutral that not even the temperature varied perceptibly. Inside, the only changes came from the screens displaying capital flows, yield curves, and composite indexes that reacted like living organisms to barely perceptible stimuli. I would spend hours watching the data move, analyzing trends that only I seemed able to perceive amid the apparent chaos. Sometimes I imagined that I was watching the pulse of a colossal body, whose heart rate I controlled without its even being aware of it. And that, paradoxically, made me feel less human. There was nothing warm about it. No victory brought genuine euphoria. No strategic move provoked pride. It was just the cold cycle of maintaining dominance, like a predator that hunts no longer for hunger, but for the instinctive habit of reaffirming who is the master of the forest. The total indifference that I had been cultivating also began to be reflected in the way I saw the past. Images of my old life, of the exhausted young man holding cups of coffee in the early hours of the morning, of my father dying without me being able to put down a Bloomberg screen to hold his hand, of friends getting married while I participated in video calls between one trade and the next. All these scenes had previously wounded me like small, insistent knives. Now, they were just weightless fragments, old stories that added nothing to the present. The initial pain that had moved me was replaced by a kind of almost philosophical apathy. I understood the origin of that hatred. I understood the path it had paved, but I could no longer feel it. The emptiness was becoming as much a part of me as the blood that ran slowly through my veins. Sometimes I would find myself standing in front of the apartment's large windows, watching the city breathe, cars flow by, tiny people crossing streets, unaware that small variations in financing rates or credit lines, caused by decisions I made with a wave of my hand, would profoundly alter their destinies. Couples would decide not to have children. Companies would not open branches. Revolving debts would become unpayable, all due to cold adjustments that, to me, represented nothing more than statistical micro-optimizations. And this awareness, far from torturing me, simply confirmed the almost metaphysical scope of what I had built. It was as if I were a natural force, as beyond good and evil as gravity itself, indifferent to whoever was in its path. Yet, in a hidden corner of my mind, I realized that all this reasoning also served to protect the last shred of sanity I had. Accepting that I was merely inevitable exempted me from moral weight. It was easier to see myself as a phenomenon than as a man, because to admit that, in the end, all of that had been my choice, a meticulous choice, cultivated day after day since that first humiliating cut at the firm, would be to acknowledge a monster that I perhaps couldn't bear to face without falling apart. As the economic cycles passed, I began to notice that my name no longer appeared even in the whispers of the corridors. I had become an entity so integrated into the financial mechanisms that I no longer needed an identity to operate. My empire managed itself through algorithms, ghost boards composed of directors whose only function was to sign carefully prepared protocols to protect decisions, while legal teams built bureaucratic walls that were impossible to scale. At times, I felt less like a man and more like the source code of a vast living system, running on servers spread across continents, automatically updating itself with each new law passed, each rate adjusted by central banks, each local crisis that served as fertilizer to reap greater profits. This almost abstract state had a curious effect on my own notion of mortality. I no longer feared illness or accidents because I understood, with brutal clarity, that even my physical death would not mean the collapse of what I had created. The structure was so distributed, so independent of my daily presence, that my disappearance would be just an administrative detail, recorded in corporate minutes before capital continued to circulate, acquiring, adjusting, firing, hiring, charging, exploiting. In some early mornings, I reflected on the ultimate irony. All the revenge that had driven me over the decades, all the hatred that I had ignited and transformed into fuel, had been transfigured into an organism that no longer needed revenge to exist. It simply continued, driven by the relentless logic of growth, by the systemic hunger that no human feeling could appease. I then realized how indifferent the world really is. No matter how poignant my original pain was, how many shattered dreams I had to pick up from the ground to rebuild my pride, in the end, the market didn't care. It simply absorbed my story as just another statistical variable, incorporated my fury as a factor of volatility, transformed my trauma into leverage that generated billions and altered planetary indexes. I had become so functional to capitalism that it no longer mattered whether I had once been a victim or a perpetrator. I was just a piece that worked better than the others, and for that reason had been preserved, magnified, multiplied. This realization did not bring me peace, nor did it provoke regret or revolt. It was a neutral feeling, as cold as the lines of code that controlled automatic transactions while I slept. I understood that there was no poetry, no hidden morality waiting to be discovered. My victories and the tragedies I had caused coexisted on the same grey plane, dissolved in a global balance sheet where profits and destruction were just opposing columns, compensating each other to keep the gears turning. And perhaps, deep down, this was the fate most faithful to the spirit of Wall Street, the one that shaped me. Not a heroic outcome, nor an exemplary punishment, but the indefinite continuation of the game, where old pieces fall and new ones emerge without the board really changing. I was just the latest evolution of this system, so adapted to cruelty that it no longer needed to justify it. And that, however perverse, was the only solid truth I had left to hold on to. There was one night in particular that marked the point of no return for me, although I only realized it much later. It was a harsh winter, the city buried in a thick snow that muffled the sounds of traffic and transformed New York into an almost surreal landscape, too white and silent for such a frenetic financial center. I was in my penthouse, sitting in the same corner as always, surrounded by backlit panels that projected indicators and exchange rate variations in real time, as if they were modern stained glass windows painting the room with pulsating data. At that moment, there was nothing critical happening in the market. No hostile attacks from competitors. No sudden political crisis. No fun-threatening liquidation that required my immediate intervention. It was just a cold, still dawn, in which theoretically I could turn everything off and allow myself a few hours of sleep. But I remained there, fixed in the chair, staring without really seeing the endless parade of graphs and reports. That was when I realized something brutal in its obviousness. I no longer had anywhere to go back to. There was no home in the emotional sense of the word. No people who awaited me with sincere expectations. No hugs capable of dissolving the armor I had built over decades. Everything around me was functional, designed to serve and protect the empire I had built myself. The assistants who managed my schedules, the lawyers who protected my operations, the analysts who filtered threats, they all orbited around the empty center that was me. There was no love, no tenderness, just silent gears carrying out tasks with precision. And then I realized that even the initial hatred that had driven me no longer existed. That primitive flame that burned in my chest when I was expelled from the bank as a disposable nuisance had completely extinguished, replaced by an immense vacuum. I no longer sought to prove anything to anyone. It no longer mattered that old directors had lost everything, that their careers and families were ruined. This had happened so long ago that it had become almost an urban legend among new analysts who didn't even know who I was. What remained was the automatic perpetuation of power for power's sake, a cycle that kept going not out of a need for revenge, but because I could no longer exist any other way. During those endless hours, I felt a strange vertigo, as if the entire building might collapse under the weight of my own emotional insignificance. Here I was, the indirect owner of conglomerates that spanned continents, capable of triggering trade wars with tiny adjustments to strategic portfolios, and yet completely devoid of any purpose beyond inertia. I felt no fear, no regret, just a cold realization, like the touch of marble. That was the ultimate price of having won. Deep down, I knew that I would always pay with absolute emptiness, because there was no other possible currency to pay for such a complete victory over the world that had rejected me. That was the only incontestable balance of my legacy. A solitude as vast as the empire I had built. In the days that followed that freezing dawn, I continued to command my operations with the same almost mechanical precision, that something had changed deep within me, even if it did not manifest itself in words or visible gestures. It was as if a definitive veil had been torn away, revealing not only the nakedness of my empire, but also that of my very being. I no longer fooled myself with rationalizations about strategy, efficiency, or the need to ensure dominance in volatile markets. All those internal speeches that for years justified each predatory acquisition, each merger that crushed smaller competitors, each surgical manipulation of collective fear or that now sounded hollow to me, without moral or emotional ballast. I continued, of course, because there was no alternative. The gears were in place, contracts signed, algorithms calibrated to perpetuate the cycle with or without my enthusiasm. The structure was so autonomous that, if I disappeared, corporate successions would continue, and my legacy of brutal concentration of capital would be perpetuated for generations. In a way, this offered me a twisted consolation. Even in the extreme case of my death, nothing would be stopped. The flow would continue, expanding, multiplying, creating new frontiers of domination and zones of economic collapse in parts of the world I had never set foot in. And while this might have sounded like a triumph to any outside observer, to me it was simply proof of the extent of the vacuum I had created. There was nothing human about it. There was no learning, no true repentance, no redemption. I did not seek forgiveness from anyone, nor could anyone grant me such a great forgiveness, since I had kept everyone at a safe distance for decades precisely, so that I would never have to rely on their judgment. Sometimes, during brief moments of nocturnal lucidity, I wondered if somewhere along the way I could have made different choices. If, when I was fired that rainy afternoon, instead of brooding over humiliation and planning the most ruthless comeback Wall Street would ever witness, I had simply accepted failure, sought another path, something outside the glass towers and chilly boardrooms. Perhaps a more modest life, with fewer numbers, but with concrete possibilities of affection. But these reflections died as quickly as they arose, crushed by the brutal logic that had become my blood. Weakness is an invitation to crushing. In that environment, only those who devour first survive. And I had not only survived, I had become the supreme predator. Any possibility of another life had been extinguished long before I was aware of the cost. Now, all that was left was to manage this colossus I had erected, this silent monument to destruction, where record profits were counted in figures so astronomical that they had become almost abstract. I could see, between the lines of the reports, the ripples of suffering spreading through small communities dependent on factories I had closed, regional banks I had forced to liquidate, credit networks I had squeezed to the breaking point. And this gave me no remorse, only a curious, tearless melancholy, the bittersweet weight of knowing that in my absolute triumph, I had also eliminated the one thing that might have saved me, the capacity to feel deeply for others or for myself. Over the next few years, I realized that the pattern of repetition had become so predictable that my direct involvement was almost redundant. The really important decisions were made before they even reached my desk, executed by successive layers of strategists and programmers who translated the empire's general guidelines into self-adapting algorithms. My role was reduced to remote, almost symbolic supervision, validating major structural movements that, in essence, would have happened even without my signature. Some days I would watch the machine work with cold efficiency, feeling less like the creator and more like a human vestige tolerated by a system that I had designed to be ruthless. With each financial cycle, the charts rose or fell as my strategies dictated. Entire funds were dismantled and reconfigured. Governments were pressured to adjust regulations to accommodate diffuse interests that, in the end, converged on conglomerates where my influence still reigned supreme. It was no longer a matter of exacting specific revenge or correcting past injustices. The game transcended these primitive impulses long ago, and I myself had become an organic component of a process of wealth concentration that justified itself by the simple fact that it worked so much better than any alternative system proposed. At such times, out of an impulse that I don't know if was masochism or simple curiosity, I would mentally revisit that scene from the past in which I was informed of the summary layoff at the company. The bored look of the director holding a tablet, the almost bureaucratic tone with which he had discarded years of my life. I tried for a long time to find a deeper meaning in that moment. Something that went beyond the utilitarian brutality of capital that rotates people like someone, replacing worn-out machine parts. But there was none. The dismissal was not a singular act of premeditated cruelty. It was merely the natural reflection of the logic that I myself would later amplify on a global scale. I was not just taking revenge on the men who had fired me. I embracing the raw rules of the market and taking them to the extreme. I perpetrated the same mechanism at full power, converting small injustices into a colossal model of indirect destruction that passed as progress in the eyes of the world. And that was perhaps the ultimate paradox. My victory was not a negation of the system that had humiliated me, but its purest expression. I did not break the rules. I respected them so much, with such strategic devotion, that I became living proof of why they are so dangerous when they encounter no human resistance. Sometimes I wondered if deep down that old director, when he signed my dismissal, was not just the inevitable harbinger of what I would become. Perhaps he projected me there, in that polished corridor, long before I myself had the courage to admit my nature. When I thought about it, I did not hate him. I felt nothing. It was like contemplating a stone on the side of a path, motionless, without guilt or glory for having caused someone to trip. This total detachment, so absolute that it eliminated even anger, was at the same time my punishment and my strength, because it meant there was no redemption possible, but also that there was no pain that could still touch me.